hope everyone is doing well during this quarantine and that you're staying safe. And if you do get outside, if you're able to keep a distance, or hopefully you're not having to make too many stops and you're finding everything you need. With this being Wednesday night, I wanted to do a lesson that's kind of is geared towards this. And if you're wondering why I'm spending so much time with this really is kind of an emotional time for a lot of people. And we just want to make sure that we get through this, and that we do have the hope that the scriptures provide to us. We are going to get through this, and we can trust God and continue to pray and so forth. But I want to hit on an area that really kind of comes up every time there's something major that happens, whether it is a natural disaster, whether it is a virus like this and an outbreak, or whatever the case might be. And that is, it's asking the question, do disasters prove that there is no God? The reason why I bring this question up is because in the atheistic world, they really like to use situations like this, and certainly dire situations, to try to prove that God does not exist and that he can't exist. If he did exist, why are there so many things that go bad? And they ask, is God unloving? Why would your God allow something like this to happen? And it is a good question. Many people, even within the Christian community, ask the question, why would God allow something like this to happen? Is he making something like this happen? I think there's a lot of confusion out there, and that people think that because this world has gotten to such a state that God is forcing this to occur. And we're going to look at a couple of things that hopefully will demonstrate that it is not God that is making this happen. And looking at some scriptures that will hopefully help add some clarity to this. First off, the reason why the atheists ask this, they bring up a couple of different major things with the arguments that they use. And I've kind of listed a few of them that I have heard over the course of time. First one is, they say, is if God is all powerful, then he could do something to prevent or end suffering. And if God is all loving, then he would want to prevent or end suffering. And as we know, there is a great amount of suffering that is in the world. We have felt it. Everyone has felt it, whether you are religious or non-religious. But the atheists they take this a step further, and they say, okay, well, because of all these things, therefore, God is either not all loving in that he will not do something, or that he is not all powerful in that he cannot do something. But is God to blame? And that's what I want to look at as we go through this lesson and reason through it. I want to just kind of pause right there, because before asking, has God created something, or is he all powerful or not all powerful, or whichever direction people take, moving back even further, going back all the way to the beginning, where death came into the world and where death entered the world. As we start to reason through this, we need to first ask, why is there even death to begin? And that, I think, will help explain and help us understand all of these things that have occurred over the course of time. We know that there have been many devastating things over the years, things that have taken the lives of millions of people at different generations, different eras, and so forth. But to ask why is there even death to begin, I think is very relevant to this conversation. When we go all the way back to Genesis, we see the account of Adam and Eve, and I don't need to reiterate it. You should be familiar with it. But you think that Adam and Eve, as long as they were in the garden, and as long as they had this dialogue with God, they were also in the same vicinity as the tree of life. The tree of life was, it was provided to them. At that time, if you notice, there's no recording of any diseases. There's no catastrophes. There's no disasters. Nothing. Everything was so pristine and such a perfect world. It was ideal for man and beast to live in. There was peace. And then everything changed. And you think of when it changed and why it changed, how it changed, and it doesn't take very much to realize that God was not the one who made that happen. God had set down the instructions for Adam and Eve, and he made it very clear to them, and then Satan comes along. Satan is a strategist. In fact, there is probably no greater strategist that we have ever seen in this world at work, aside from God, than Satan. And Satan knew how to operate, and he knows how to operate today. And Satan is not naive to the consequences. He is constantly looking ahead, and he studies us as he studied them. In fact, you think that Satan was around even before with man. Satan was there, and Satan comes into this picture and knows that man had this communication with God, and he knew that the moment that he could get man to violate God's instruction, that it was going to change everything. He knew that it was going to affect the relationship between man and God. He knew that there were going to be consequences because of man's sin, transgressing from God's direction. He knew that there was, that things were going to change, things were going to shift if he could get man to turn away from God or to violate what God had already commanded to him. And so Satan is not naive to what was going to happen. And looking ahead, if he could get man to sin, he would remove his place with God, and in turn remove his place from the tree of life. He was smart this way, and he was successful in getting Eve and ultimately Adam to turn away from God. And that's why we need to understand why death even came into the world in the first place. It wasn't God saying, I'm going to make all this stuff happen. God isn't the kind of God that creates man and then just, causes everything bad to happen to him. But when death enters the world, there are obviously so many different variations and so many different diverse factors at play with how death is going to take man and how it's going to take us. If you look at Romans chapter 5 and verse 12, Paul really identifies what the catalyst is for man suffering the way that he is. In Romans 5 and verse 12, he writes, therefore, just as though one man's sin entered the world, and death through sin, and thus death spread to all men because all sinned. Now, it's important to realize, we're not held accountable for that sin that Adam did, but we certainly feel the consequences of that. And when you look at sin today, sin does not just impact the immediate person who is found guilty. The one who sins very often, in fact, more often than not, will impact those around him. One sin has the capability of affecting, family members, loved ones, friends, and it goes even beyond that. And when you look at what happened with Adam, even though we're not held accountable for that sin, his sin is not going to be able to condemn me to a sinner's hell, but we do feel the consequences of that sin because of what he had did. And so once Adam sinned, once he violated what God had said, and he's removed from the tree of life, we see the impact. We see that this domino effect of how now that he's removed from the tree of life, it means that all of his offspring would be removed from the tree of life. And you go all through history, and here we are today being removed from the tree of life, and that's why we have death in the world. And within that confines of what of that death, we know that there are so many different ways that one can ultimately die. And we see disasters that happen. We see different diseases that have occurred. And, because man is not in that perfect state anymore, we are now these corruptible beings, and different things can happen to us. And so God has set up all of these different ways, or has allowed these different ways to kind of come about with our sin. Natural disasters, they happen and have been recorded throughout history. You have these diseases, the viruses like we're seeing today. This is not the only time that these have happened. They've been around for centuries. In fact, I want to kind of take you through a list of the top 10 viruses, since we're dealing with viruses right now. We know that there are many earthquakes that have happened, and we've seen devastation from hurricanes that have happened. My family was just in Utah for for an earthquake that affected a lot of different things, and it wasn't even a major one, but we know that there have been, just significant earthquakes over the course of time that have just, that it has leveled different cities. We know hurricanes. We know when I lived in Florida, we went through a number of different hurricanes, and those who've been through all of these different kinds of natural disasters, whether it's flooding, typhoons, whether, just different things with catastrophic results, I've happened through it. But I want to bring to your attention 10 of the worst pandemics that we have seen in history, since we're dealing with this pandemic that we are right now with coronavirus and so forth. Back from 2005 to about 2012, HIV and AIDS were at its very peak. The death toll for HIV at that point, just during those years alone, were 36 million. That is far more than what we're even seeing right now with the coronavirus. In 1968, there was a flu pandemic. The death toll at that point was 1 million, still far more than what we have seen today. From 1956 to 1958, there was what they called the Asian flu, and the death toll at that point was 2 million during those years. Back in 1918, and you're probably familiar with this because the media has really made a lot of references to the flu pandemic of 1918, the death toll at that point was 20 to 50 million. In fact, there were so many at that point in time that it infected over 1/3 of the world's population. That was how deadly that virus was at that point. In 1910 through 1911, what they called the 6th cholera pandemic. Death toll for that was over 800,000 people. And then in 1889 through 1890, there was another flu pandemic. The death toll was 1 million during that time. From 1852 to 1860, they had what they called the 3rd cholera pandemic. And so they labeled these as each time it hit, death toll was 1 million for that one. In 1346 through 1353, they had the Black Death. The death toll for that was 75 to 200 million people during that time. That was caused by the bubonic plague. And we read about a lot of that in our medieval kind of history books and our history over the years, and we're able to see the devastation of it. From 541 to 542, they had the plague of Justinian. Death toll was 25 million. That one was also caused by the bubonic plague. In 165 AD, they had what they called the Antonine plague. Death toll was at 5 million. You take all of these, and these are not even the bulk of what has hit us worldwide with pandemics and viruses and diseases that have come around. And when you look at the numbers of here, it is bad. It's always bad when we lose lives. But as far as the numbers are concerned, we are at a very low percentage right now. But every time something like this comes along, the atheists go wild and they say, well, see, this is, it shows that God isn't doing anything. And it causes, in turn, I think sometimes, for the religious world to get concerned, and they worry and say, well, is God going to get us through this? Is God, is God really going to just let this happen? Why are bad things like this happening to such good people? What did we do that was so bad? And I think there's a level of guilt that we feel because we think, is that God making this happen because we're doing things a certain way? And that's just not the case. Not only, we've had these viruses, but we've had these hurricanes, we've had tornadoes, we've had floods, we've had earthquakes, avalanches, typhoons. All of these things have happened in the past. And as long as we're on this earth until Christ comes again, these things are going to continue to happen. And, they mentioned, I saw one report saying that the flu pandemic of 1918, they were not able to catch it. And it caused a lot of devastation back then. They didn't have the medical facilities or the personnel that we have today. And they say it happens about once every 100 years where something does, start to spread like this. And, and so they try to go back to that time, which was almost 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years, I guess. And, they say, okay, this is where our 100-year virus is, going again. But, we're able to contain this if we're smart. And we've heard from a lot of different reports from medical experts that we can get this under control. But even more important, we know that God is in control and we can trust him. But why are all of these things happening? Why do bad things happen? Why do these natural disasters and these viruses hit? I want to use the flood as kind of an example as we look through this, because I think that if we can consider the global flood, it helps us to understand why death is in the world and how it changes things when sin and wickedness do enter. And you think of why the flood happened to begin. God caused this global flood because of man's wickedness. In fact, man was so wicked. Remember, God said that he repented of even making man. That didn't mean that he was sorry. God is not going to be sorry. You know that God was aware that everything he made was good, very good. But man was so wicked, it got to such a point that God said, okay, I'm going to clean the surface. And as we read back in the Genesis account, there's a global flood that happened. Noah is preaching for 120 years, trying to get people on board with following what God said was going to occur. And only 8 souls responded to this preaching. But you consider the power of the flood, which was all, again, a result of this wickedness from man. You look at Genesis chapter 7 and we see this entire account laid out. The flood was the most catastrophic event ever recorded, ever. And we see different cultures talk about the flood in their own way. The Chinese, different Asian cultures talk about this. And the flood is widely accepted. And we don't have to get into the authenticity of the flood. That's a different study. But we know that this thing happened, and it happened, which affected the entire planet. And it shifted and changed literally everything that was on there. It affected all forms of life and the entire surface of the earth. And it's not unreasonable to think that the flood of Genesis chapter 6 through 8 radically altered how the earth is even shaped today and what is going on in the earth as far as all of these disasters. It simultaneously produced circumstances responsible for many of these natural disasters that have happened. In fact, if you look over at Psalm chapter 104, we see David talking about these very events. And it affected them back then, and it still affects us today. But in Psalm 104, beginning in verse 6, he writes, "You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains, and at your rebuke they fled. At the voice of your thunder they hastened away. They went up over the mountains. They went down into the valleys to the place which you founded for them. And you have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. And he sends the springs into the valleys, and they flow among the hills, and they give drink to every beast of the field. The wild donkeys quench their thirst, and by them the birds of the heavens have their home. And they sing among the branches, and he waters the hills from his upper chambers, and the earth is satisfied with the fruit of your works." This is interesting for a couple of reasons. One is that you realize that the same waters that destroyed man for his wickedness are also the waters that sustain life. God can use his creation for different things and for different purposes. And when he did this with the flood, it changed everything. Notice what David said, that he was able to cover the earth with these floods, but then he was able to pull it away. That's the power that God had, and that was how serious sin was at that point. And that sin and everything that happened because Adam had transgressed from God. That's when death came into the world. We know that there was death before that flood. There was obviously going to be death after that flood, and during that flood, look how much devastation there was as well. But it's interesting when you look at Psalm chapter 104, because even today we see this, that there's approximately 72% of the earth's surface that is still covered with water. Because of that flood, which was a result of man's wickedness, temperature changes occurred. You notice before the flood how long life was, the longevity of how long people had lived, versus after the flood. Temperature changes occurred, but it was vastly different geological and meteorological phenomenon where they were present after the flood. It drastically changed the component of Earth's crust to give rise to earthquakes, and that's why we see a lot of earthquakes today, all a result of what had happened with the flood. Vast bodies of water, large global climatic variations, which spawned hurricanes and tropical storms, were all a product of what happened with the flood, this global event that occurred. Man's wickedness brought all of this about. It's not God that's forcing this to happen. God gave us choice. That is one of the greatest gifts that man could ever have, is God, is the ability to be able to choose whatever we want to do. But God also knew that there's going to be consequences with those choices. He knew that there were going to be bad choices if he gave man choice. But man's wickedness ultimately is the thing that brought all of this on. The bad choices that man made, the things that he shouldn't have. But I think it's relevant as we look at some of these natural disasters and these viruses and so forth, in understanding that God created the world with the intention of it being ruled by natural laws. When you look at natural laws today, those are laws that have been given to this world by God. Okay, if you think and we have a lot of different natural laws that we see today. If someone goes out and steps off of a roof, we know that gravity is going to pull him down. He's not going to float. We know that, with natural law, that two objects cannot occupy the same space at the same time. I know that if I step in front of a moving train or a moving car, those two objects physically are not going to be able to occupy that. Something is going to give. And water, when you look at it, water can produce good or bad results. Water is good, it's great for boating. But that same water that's used for boating can be the same water that someone drowns. When you look at rain, the purpose of rain, when God gives rain, it's just it helps the plants, it does help the ecosystem and so forth. But you realize the purpose of rain is not to flood. And yet if it rains enough, flooding can occur. You look at fire. Fire can produce good or bad results. The same heat, it can provide heat for cooking, it can provide light, it can provide warmth, but it can also destroy entire homes or forests, can it? We remember the fires up at Paradise last year and the devastation that fire can bring. God is not a respecter of persons. And neither is natural law. And that is exactly what he meant when he brought natural law into this world. Look over at Luke chapter 13, if you would. In Luke chapter 13, beginning in verse 1 through 5, and this is where it starts to answer the question, is God making this happen because we're sinful people? Are we, as society becomes so sinful, what are we doing to make things like this virus come about? What are we doing to make these earthquakes come about? We know that every year there's hurricane season, where dozens, literally, of hurricanes come through the Caribbean, and it can destroy a lot of different property. It can destroy lives, and people always ask the same things. Every time it happens, is this something that God is making happen because he is just so fed up with all of his creation? And the answer is no. And we can see that with examples from Scripture. In Luke chapter 13, beginning in verse 1, we see a very vivid account as Luke records the words of Christ. It says, there were present at that season some who told him about the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. And Jesus answered and said to them, do you suppose that the Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered such things? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Or those 18 on whom the tower in Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse sinners than all the other men who dwell in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. You see, these things didn't happen because these people were just, were inherently sinful. Things are going to happen. And as we see today, things happen, and it's a great way to get close to God, to pray instead of blaming God for all of these things happening, to appeal to God and just ask him to be with us as we go through this. Because there's no better place to be than when we know that God is watching us and God is compassionate and he cares about us and he's going to ride this entire thing through along with us. But some still ask, well, why can't God selectively intervene? to prevent disasters. I think that's an emotional response that I think is probably more normal than we think. Someone that we love is on their deathbed, and we just pray, God, can't you just, for this one person or this one circumstance, save them. Give them the treatment that they need. Someone who has been hurt by something. We ask, God, can't you just, take this and deal with this one thing? And then we get to the point where we start comparing things because we're just, as we deal with our emotions, sometimes we get irrational. And we think, God, why is this over here? Why did they get through it over here and they didn't over here? Why are we not able to get through it the way that they did? And we start thinking, well, that maybe God just cares about them a little bit more than us. But that's not the way it happens. And we need to understand that. God is not a respecter of person. I want to read a quote by a man named Bruce Reichenbach. He's the professor of philosophy at Augsburg College in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Listen to what he says. And I think this is very significant when we start to try to reason things inaccurately like this. He says, in a world which operates according to divine miraculous intervention, there would be no necessary relation between phenomena and in particular between cause and effect. In some instances, one event would follow from a certain set of conditions, another time a different event, and so on, such that ultimately an uncountable variety of events would follow a given set of conditions. There would be no regularity of consequence, no natural production of effects, and hence we could not know or even suppose what course of action to take to accomplish a certain rationally conceived goal. And thus, we could neither propose action nor act ourselves. In other words, if God always intervened, then man would not know how to respond. There would be no reason to respond. There would be no reason to do really anything. Sin would be of no consequence if God always intervened. You think about that. We know that because of sin, death entered the world. But if God just continually intervened and said, okay, I'm going to just stop this from happening. I'm going to stop this bullet. I'm going to stop this, this hurricane. I'm going to stop this wind. I'm going to stop this virus. And there'd be no reason for us to even appeal to repentance because we know God is going to be there every step of the way. But we know that's not the case. We need God. And we know that he's going to be there for us. Instead of blaming God when tragedies strike, why not turn to him for strength? Disasters remind us that this world was never intended to be our final home. We have no wickedness. We'd have no disasters. God is not to be blamed for all of this. When we look at James chapter 4 and verse 14 as we close here, James says, whereas ye know not what shall be on the morrow, for what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. We know that things are going to happen to cause the end of the life for some people. But the most important question is not, why is this happening? God didn't make this happen. He allowed this to happen, and it was based on our decision that we made going all the way back to the garden. The question we should be asking is, how can I understand what has happened? How am I going to react to it? And the answer to that is to build your hope on things eternal.